12. A Battle of Power. Thursday, December 28th, 1961. We started on a journey very early in the morning. We drove south and then east to the mountains. Don Juan had brought gourds with food and water. We ate in my car before we started walking. "Stick close to me," he said. "This is an unknown region to you, and there's no need to take chances. You're going in search of power, and everything you do counts. Watch the wind, especially towards the end of the day. Watch when it changes direction and shift your position so that I always shield you from it." "What are we going to do in these mountains, Don Juan?" "You're hunting power." "I mean, what are we going to do in particular?" "There's no plan when it comes to hunting power. Hunting power or hunting game is the same. A hunter hunts whatever presents itself to him. Thus, he must always be in a state of readiness. You know about the wind, and now you may hunt power in the wind by yourself. But there are other things you don't know about, which are, like the wind, the center of power at certain times and at certain places. Power is a very peculiar affair," he said. "It's impossible to pin it down and say what it really is. It's a feeling that one has about certain things. Power is personal. It belongs to oneself alone. My benefactor, for instance, could make a person mortally ill by merely looking at him. Women would wane away after he had set eyes on them. Yet he didn't make people sick all the time, but only when his personal power was involved." "How did he choose who to make sick?" "I don't know that. He didn't know it himself. Power's like that. It commands you, and yet it obeys you. A hunter of power entraps it, and then stores it away as his personal finding. Thus, personal power grows, and you may have the case of a warrior who has so much personal power that he becomes a man of knowledge." "How does one store power, Don Juan?" "That, again, is another feeling. It depends on what kind of a person the warrior is. My benefactor was a man of violent nature. He stored power through that feeling. Everything he did was strong and direct. He left me a memory of something crushing through things. And everything that happened to him took place in that manner." I told him that I couldn't understand how power was stored through a feeling. "There's no way to explain it," he said after a long pause. "You have to do it yourself." He picked up the gourds with food and fastened them to his back. He handed me a string with 8 pieces of dry meat strung on it and made me hang it from my neck. "This is power food," he said. "What makes it power food, Don Juan?" "It's the meat of an animal that had power, a deer, a unique deer. My personal power brought it to me. This meat will sustain us for weeks, months, if need be. Chew little bits of it at a time, and chew it thoroughly. Let the power sink slowly into your body." We began to walk. It was almost 11 a.m. Don Juan reminded me once more of the procedure to follow. "Watch the wind," he said. "Don't let it trip you, and don't let it make you tired. Chew your power food and hide from the wind behind my body. The wind won't hurt me. We know each other very well." He led me to a trail that went straight to the high mountains. The day was cloudy, and it was about to rain. I could see low rain clouds and fog up above in the mountains descending into the area where we were. We hiked in complete silence until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Chewing the dry meat was indeed invigorating, and watching for sudden changes in the direction of the wind became a mysterious affair, to the point that my entire body seemed to sense changes before they actually happened. I had the feeling that I could detect waves of wind as a sort of pressure on my upper chest, on my bronchial tubes. Every time I was about to feel a gust of wind, my chest and throat would itch. Don Juan stopped for a moment and looked around. He appeared to be orienting himself, and then he turned to the right. I noticed that he was also chewing dry meat. I felt very fresh and wasn't tired at all. The task of being aware of shifts in the wind had been so consuming that I hadn't been aware of time. We walked into a deep ravine, and then up one side to a small plateau on the sheer side of an enormous mountain. We were quite high, almost to the top of the mountain. Don Juan climbed a huge rock at the end of the plateau and helped me up to it. The rock was placed in such a way as to look like a dome on top of precipitous walls. We slowly walked around it. Finally, I had to move around the rock on my seat, holding on to the surface with my heels and hands. I was soaked in perspiration and had to dry my hands repeatedly. From the other side, I could see a very large, shallow cave near the top of the mountain. It looked like a hall that had been carved out of the rock. It was sandstone, which had been weathered into a sort of balcony with 2 pillars. Don Juan said that we were going to camp there, that it was a very safe place because it was too shallow to be a den for lions or any other predators, too open to be a nest for rats, and too windy for insects. He laughed and said that it was an ideal place for men, since no other living creatures could stand it. He climbed up to it like a mountain goat. I marveled at his stupendous agility. I slowly dragged myself down the rock on my seat and then tried to run up the side of the mountain in order to reach the ledge. The last few yards completely exhausted me. I kiddingly asked Don Juan how old he really was. I thought that in order to reach the ledge the way he had done it, one had to be extremely fit and young. "I'm as young as I want to be," he said. "This again is a matter of personal power. If you store power, your body can perform unbelievable feats. On the other hand, if you dissipate power, you'll be a fat old man in no time at all." The length of the ledge was oriented along an east-west line. The open side of the balcony-like formation was to the south. I walked to the west end. The view was superb. The rain had circumvented us. It looked like a sheet of transparent material hung over the low land. Don Juan said that we had enough time to build a shelter. He told me to make a pile of as many rocks as I could carry onto the ledge, while he gathered some branches for a roof. In an hour, he had built a wall about a foot thick on the east end of the ledge. It was about 2 feet long and 3 feet high. He wove and tied some bundles of branches he had collected and made a roof, securing it onto 2 long poles that ended in forks. There was another pole of the same length that was affixed to the roof itself and which supported it on the opposite side of the wall. The structure looked like a high table with 3 legs. Don Juan sat cross-legged under it, on the very edge of the balcony. He told me to sit next to him, to his right. We remained quiet for a while. Don Juan broke the silence. He said in a whisper that we had to act as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I asked if there was something in particular that I should do. He said that I should get busy writing, and do it in such a way that it would be as if I were at my desk with no worries in the world except writing. At a given moment, he was going to nudge me, and then I should look where he was pointing with his eyes. He warned me that no matter what I saw, I shouldn't utter a single word. Only he could talk with impunity, because he was known to all the powers in those mountains. I followed his instructions and wrote for over an hour. I became immersed in my task. Suddenly, I felt a soft tap on my arm and saw Don Juan's eyes and head move to point out a bank of fog about 200 yards away, which was descending from the top of the mountain. Don Juan whispered in my ear with a tone barely audible even at that close range. "Move your eyes back and forth along the bank of fog," he said, "but don't look at it directly. Blink your eyes and don't focus them on the fog. When you see a green spot on the bank of fog, point it out to me with your eyes." I moved my eyes from left to right along the bank of fog that was slowly coming down to us. Perhaps half an hour went by. It was getting dark. The fog moved extremely slowly. At one moment, I had a sudden feeling that I detected a faint glow to my right. At first, I thought that I had seen a patch of green shrubbery through the fog. When I looked at it directly, I didn't notice anything. But when I looked without focusing, I could detect a vague greenish area. I pointed it out to Don Juan. He squinted his eyes and stared at it. "Focus your eyes on that spot," he whispered in my ear. "Look without blinking until you see." I wanted to ask what I was supposed to see, but he glared at me as if to remind me that I shouldn't talk. I stared again. The bit of fog that had come down from above hung as if it were a piece of solid matter. It was lined up right at the spot where I'd noticed the green tint. As my eyes became tired again and I squinted, I saw at first the bit of fog superimposed on the fog bank. And then I saw a thin strip of fog in between that looked like a thin, unsupported structure. A bridge joining the mountain above me and the bank of fog in front of me. For a moment, I thought I could see the transparent fog, which was being blown down from the top of the mountain, going by the bridge without disturbing it. It was as if the bridge were actually solid. At one instant, the mirage became so complete that I could actually distinguish the darkness of the part under the bridge proper, as opposed to the light sandstone color of its side. I stared at the bridge, dumbfounded. And then I either lifted myself to its level, or the bridge lowered itself to mine. Suddenly, I was looking at a straight beam in front of me. It was an immensely long, solid beam, narrow and without railings, but wide enough to walk on. Don Juan shook me by the arm vigorously. I felt my head bobbing up and down, and then I noticed that my eyes itched terribly. I rubbed them quite unconsciously. Don Juan kept on shaking me until I opened my eyes again. He poured some water from his gourd into the hollow of his hand and sprinkled my face with it. The sensation was very unpleasant. The coldness of the water was so extreme that the drops felt like sores on my skin. I noticed then that my body was very warm. I was feverish. Don Juan hurriedly gave me some water to drink and then splashed water on my ears and neck. I heard a very loud, eerie, and prolonged bird cry. Don Juan listened attentively for an instant and then pushed the rocks of the wall with his foot and collapsed the roof. He threw the roof into the shrubs and tossed all the rocks one by one over the side. He whispered in my ear, "Drink some water and chew your dry meat. We can't stay here. That cry was not a bird." We climbed down the ledge and began to walk in an easterly direction. In no time at all, it was so dark that it was as if there were a curtain in front of my eyes. The fog was like an impenetrable barrier. I'd never realized how crippling the fog was at night. I couldn't conceive how Don Juan walked. I held on to his arm as if I were blind. Somehow, I had the feeling I was walking on the edge of a precipice. My legs refused to move on. My reason trusted Don Juan, and I was rationally willing to go on. But my body was not, and Don Juan had to drag me in total darkness. He must have known the terrain to ultimate perfection. He stopped at a certain point and made me sit down. I didn't dare let go of his arm. My body felt, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that I was sitting on a barren, dome-like mountain, and if I moved an inch to my right, I would fall beyond the tolerance point into an abysm. I was absolutely sure I was sitting on a curved mountainside because my body moved unconsciously to the right. I thought it did so in order to keep its verticality, so I tried to compensate by leaning to the left against Don Juan as far as I could. Don Juan suddenly moved away from me, and without the support of his body, I fell on the ground. Touching the ground restored my sense of equilibrium. I was lying on a flat area. I began to reconnoiter my immediate surroundings by touch. I recognized dry leaves and twigs. There was a sudden flash of lightning that illuminated the whole area and tremendous thunder. I saw Don Juan standing to my left. I saw huge trees and a cave a few feet behind him. Don Juan told me to get into the hole. I crawled into it and sat down with my back against the rock. I felt Don Juan leaning over to whisper that I had to be totally silent. There were 3 flashes of lightning, one after the other. In a glance, I saw Don Juan sitting cross-legged to my left. The cave was a concave formation, big enough for 2 or 3 persons to sit in. The hole seemed to have been carved at the bottom of a boulder. I felt that it had indeed been wise of me to have crawled into it, because if I had been walking, I would have knocked my head against the rock. The brilliancy of the lightning gave me an idea of how thick the bank of fog was. I noticed the trunks of enormous trees as dark silhouettes against the opaque, light gray mass of the fog. Don Juan whispered that the fog and the lightning were in cahoots with each other, and I had to keep an exhausting vigil because I was engaged in a battle of power. At that moment, a stupendous flash of lightning rendered the whole scenery phantasmagorical. The fog was like a white filter that frosted the light of the electrical discharge and diffused it uniformly. The fog was like a dense, whitish substance hanging between the tall trees, but right in front of me at the ground level, the fog was thinning out. I plainly distinguished the features of the terrain. We were in a pine forest. Very tall trees surrounded us. They were so extremely big that I could have sworn we were in the redwoods, if I hadn't previously known our whereabouts. There was a barrage of lightning that lasted several minutes. Each flash made the features I'd already observed more discernible. Right in front of me, I saw a definite trail. There was no vegetation on it. It seemed to end in an area clear of trees. There were so many flashes of lightning that I couldn't keep track of where they were coming from. The scenery, however, had been so profusely illuminated that I felt much more at ease. My fears and uncertainties had vanished as soon as there had been enough light to lift the heavy curtain of darkness. So when there was a long pause between the flashes of lightning, I was no longer disoriented by the blackness around me. Don Juan whispered that I had probably done enough watching, and that I had to focus my attention on the sound of thunder. I realized, to my amazement, that I hadn't paid any attention to thunder at all, in spite of the fact that it had really been tremendous. Don Juan added that I should follow the sound and look in the direction where I thought it came from. There were no longer barrages of lightning and thunder, but only sporadic flashes of intense light and sound. The thunder seemed to always come from my right. The fog was lifting, and I, already being accustomed to the pitch black, could distinguish masses of vegetation. The lightning and thunder continued, and suddenly the whole right side opened up, and I could see the sky. The electrical storm seemed to be moving towards my right. There was another flash of lightning, and I saw a distant mountain to my extreme right. The light illuminated the background, silhouetting the bulky mass of the mountain. I saw trees on top of it. They looked like neat black cutouts, superimposed on the brilliantly white sky. I even saw cumulus clouds over the mountains. The fog had cleared completely around us. There was a steady wind, and I could hear the rustling of leaves in the big trees to my left. The electrical storm was too distant to illuminate the trees, but their dark masses remained discernible. The light of the storm allowed me to establish, however, that there was a range of distant mountains to my right, and that the forest was limited to the left side. It seemed that I was looking down into a dark valley, which I couldn't see at all. The range over which the electrical storm was taking place was on the opposite side of the valley. Then it began to rain. I pressed back against the rock as far as I could. My hat served as a good protection. I was sitting with my knees to my chest, and only my calves and shoes got wet. It rained for a long time. The rain was lukewarm. I felt it on my feet. And then I fell asleep. The noises of birds woke me up. I looked around for Don Juan. He wasn't there. Ordinarily, I would have wondered whether he had left me there alone, but the shock of seeing my surroundings nearly paralyzed me. I stood up. My legs were soaking wet. The brim of my hat was soggy, and there was still some water in it that spilled over me. I wasn't in a cave at all, but under some thick bushes. I experienced a moment of unparalleled confusion. I was standing on a flat piece of land between two small dirt hills covered with bushes. There were no trees to my left and no valley to my right. Right in front of me, where I'd seen the path in the forest, there was a gigantic bush. I refused to believe what I was witnessing. The incongruency of my two versions of reality made me grapple for any kind of explanation. It occurred to me that it was perfectly possible that I had slept so soundly that Don Juan might have carried me on his back to another place without waking me. I examined the spot where I'd been sleeping. The ground there was dry, and so was the ground on the spot next to it, where Don Juan had been. I called him a couple of times, and then had an attack of anxiety and bellowed his name as loud as I could. He came out from behind some bushes. I immediately became aware that he knew what was going on. His smile was so mischievous that I ended up smiling myself. I didn't want to waste any time in playing games with him. I blurted out what was the matter with me. I explained as carefully as possible every detail of my night-long hallucinations. He listened without interrupting. He couldn't, however, keep a serious face and started to laugh a couple of times, but he regained his composure right away. I asked for his comments 3 or 4 times. He only shook his head, as if the whole affair was also incomprehensible to him. When I ended my account, he looked at me and said, "You look awful. Maybe you need to go to the bushes." He cackled for a moment, and then added that I should take off my clothes and wring them out so they would dry. The sunlight was brilliant. There were very few clouds. It was a windy, brisk day. Don Juan walked away, telling me that he was going to look for some plants and that I should compose myself and eat something, and not call him until I was calm and strong.
As we left the restaurant, I told Don Juan that he had been correct in warning me about the difficulty of the topic, and that my intellectual prowess was inadequate to grasp his concepts and explanations. I suggested that perhaps if I should go to my hotel and read my notes, my comprehension of the subject might improve. He tried to put me at ease. He said that I was worrying about words. While he was speaking, I experienced a shiver, and for an instant, I sensed that there was indeed another area within me. I mentioned to Don Juan that I was having some inexplicable feelings. My statement apparently aroused his curiosity. I told him that I'd had the same feelings before, and that they seemed to be momentary lapses, interruptions in my flow of awareness. They always manifested themselves as a jolt in my body, followed by the sensation that I was suspended in something. We headed for downtown, walking leisurely. Don Juan asked me to relate all the details of my lapses. I had a hard time describing them, beyond the point of calling them moments of forgetfulness, or absent-mindedness, or not watching what I was doing. He patiently rebuffed me. He pointed out that I was a demanding person, had an excellent memory, and was very careful in my actions. It had occurred to me at first that those peculiar lapses were associated with stopping the internal dialogue. But I also had them when I had talked to myself extensively. They seemed to stem from an area independent of everything I knew. Don Juan patted me on the back. He smiled with apparent delight. "You're finally beginning to make real connections," he said. I asked him to explain his cryptic statement, but he abruptly stopped our conversation and signalled me to follow him to a small park in front of a church. "This is the end of our journey to downtown," he said, and sat down on a bench. "Right here we have an ideal spot to watch people. There are some who walk by on the street and others who come to church. From here we can see everyone." He pointed to a wide business street and to the gravel walk leading to the steps of the church. Our bench was located midway between the church and the street. "This is my favourite bench," he said, caressing the wood. He winked at me and added with a grin, "It likes me. That's why no one was sitting there. It knew I was coming." The bench knew that. No, not the bench. My narwhal. Does the narwhal have consciousness? Is it aware of things? Of course, it is aware of everything. That's why I'm interested in your account. What you call lapses and feelings is the narwhal. In order to talk about it, we must borrow from the island of the tonal. Therefore, it is more convenient not to explain it, but to simply recount its effects. I wanted to say something else about those peculiar feelings, but he hushed me. "No more. Today is not the day of the narwhal. Today is the day of the tonal," he said. "I put on my suit because today I am all tonal." He stared at me. I was about to tell him that the subject was proving to be more difficult than anything he had ever explained to me. He seemed to have anticipated my words. "It is difficult," he continued. "I know it. But considering that this is the final lid, the last stage of what I've been teaching you, it's not too far-fetched to say that it envelops everything I mentioned since the first day we met." We remained quiet for a long while. I felt that I had to wait for him to resume his explanation, but I had a sudden attack of apprehension and hurriedly asked, "Are the narwhal and the tonal within ourselves?" He looked at me, piercing. "Very difficult question," he said. "You yourself would say that they are within ourselves. I myself would say that they are not, but neither of us would be right. The tonal of your time calls for you to maintain that everything dealing with your feelings and thoughts takes place within yourself. The sorcerer's tonal says the opposite. Everything is outside. Who's right? No one. Inside, outside, doesn't really matter." I raised a point. I said that when he talked about the tonal and the narwhal, it seemed as if there was still a third part. He had said that the tonal forces us to perform acts. I asked him to tell me who he was referring to as being forced. He did not answer me directly. "To explain all this is not that simple," he said. "No matter how clever the checkpoints of the tonal are, the fact of the matter is that the narwhal surfaces. Its coming to the surface is always inadvertent, though. The tonal's great art is to suppress any manifestation of the narwhal in such a manner that even if its presence should be the most obvious thing in the world, it is unnoticeable. For whom is it unnoticeable?" He chuckled, shaking his head up and down. I pressed him for an answer. For the tonal, he said. I'm speaking about it exclusively. I may go around in circles, but that shouldn't surprise or annoy you. I warned you about the difficulty of understanding what I have to tell. I went through all that rigmarole because my tonal is aware that it is speaking about itself. In other words, my tonal is using itself in order to understand the information I want your tonal to be clear about. Let's say that the tonal, since it is keenly aware of how taxing it is to speak of itself, has created the terms I, myself, and so forth, as a balance, and thanks to them it can talk with other tonals, or with itself, about itself. Now when I say that the tonal forces us to do something, I don't mean that there is a third party there. Obviously it forces itself to follow its own judgments. On certain occasions, however, or under certain special circumstances, something in the tonal itself becomes aware that there is more to us. It is like a voice that comes from the depths, the voice of the Nawa. You see, the totality of ourselves is a natural condition which the tonal cannot obliterate altogether. And there are moments, especially in the life of a warrior, when the totality becomes apparent. At those moments, one can surmise and assess what we really are. I was concerned with those jolts you have had because that is the way the Nawal surfaces. At those moments, the tonal becomes aware of the totality of oneself. It is always a jolt because that awareness disrupts the lull. I call that awareness the totality of the being that is going to die. The idea is that at the moment of death, the other member of the true pair, the Nawal, becomes fully operative, and the awareness and memories and perceptions stored in our calves and thighs, in our back and shoulders and neck, begin to expand and disintegrate. Like the beads of an endless broken necklace, they fall asunder without the binding force of life. He looked at me. His eyes were peaceful. I felt ill at ease, stupid. The totality of ourselves is a very tacky affair, he said. We need only a very small portion of it to fulfill the most complex tasks of life. Yet, when we die with the totality of ourselves. The sorcerer asks the question, if we're going to die with the totality of ourselves, why not then live with that totality? He signalled me with his head to watch the scores of people that went by. They're all tonal, he said. I'm going to single some of them out so your tonal will assess them. And in assessing them, it will assess itself. He directed my attention to two old ladies that had emerged from the church. They stood at the top of the limestone steps for a moment, and then began to walk down with infinite care, resting on every step. Watch those two women very carefully, he said, but don't see them as persons, or as faces that hold things in common with us. See them as tonals. The two women got to the bottom of the steps. They moved as if the rough gravel were marbles and they were about to roll and lose their balances. They walked arm in arm, propping each other up with the weight of their bodies. Look at them, Don Juan said in a low voice. Those women are the best example of the most miserable tonal one can find. I noticed that the two women were small-boned but fat. They were perhaps in their early 50s. They had a painful look in their faces, as if walking down the church steps had been beyond their strength. They were in front of us. They vacillated for a moment, and then they came to a halt. There was one more step on the gravel walk. What's your step, ladies? Don Juan shouted as he stood up dramatically. The women looked at him, apparently confused by his sudden outburst. my mom broke her hip right there the other day," he added, and dashed over to help them. They thanked him profusely, and he advised them that if they ever lost their balance and fell down, they had to remain motionless on the spot until the ambulance came. His tone was sincere and convincing. The women crossed themselves. Don Juan sat down again. His eyes were beaming. He spoke softly. "Those women are not that old, and their bodies are not that weak, and yet they are decrepit. Everything about them is dreary. Their clothes, their smell, their attitude. Why do you think that's so?" "Maybe they were born that way," I said. "No one is born that way. We make ourselves that way. The tonal of those women is weak and timid." I said that today was going to be the day of the tonal. I meant that today I want to deal with it exclusively. I also said that I had to put on my suit for that specific purpose. With it I wanted to show you that a warrior treats his tonal in a very special manner. I pointed out to you that my suit has been made to order and that everything I have on today fits me to perfection. It is not my vanity that I wanted to show, but my warrior's spirit, my warrior's tonal. Those two women gave you your first view of the tonal today. Life can be as merciless with you as it is with them, if you are careless with your tonal. I put myself as the counterpart. If you understand correctly, I should not need to stress this point. I had a sudden attack of uncertainty and asked him to spell out what I should have understood. I must have sounded desperate. He laughed out loud. "Look at that young man in green pants and a pink shirt," Don Juan whispered, pointing to a very thin and very dark complexioned, sharp-featured young man who was standing almost in front of us. He seemed to be undecided whether to go towards the church or towards the street. Twice he raised his hand in the direction of the church as though he were talking to himself and were about to start moving towards it. Then he stared at me with a blank expression. "Look at the way he's dressed," Don Juan said in a whisper. "Look at those shoes." The young man's clothes were tattered and wrinkled, and his shoes were in absolute pieces. "He's obviously very poor," I said. "Is that all you can say about him?" he asked. I enumerated a series of reasons that might have accounted for the young man's shabbiness. Poor health, bad luck, indolence, indifference to his personal appearance, or the chance that he may have just been released from prison. Don Juan said that I was merely speculating, and that he was not interested in justifying anything by suggesting that the man was a victim of unconquerable forces. "Maybe he's a secret agent made to look like a bum," I said jokingly. The young man walked away towards the street with a disjointed gait. "He's not made to look like a bum. He is a bum," Don Juan said. "Look how weak his body is. His arms and legs are thin. He can hardly walk. No one can pretend to look that way. There is something definitely wrong with him. Not his circumstances, though. I have to stress again that I want you to see that man as a tonal. What does it entail to see a man as a tonal? It entails to cease judging him in a moral sense, or excusing him on the grounds that he is like a leaf at the mercy of the wind. In other words, it entails seeing a man without thinking that he is hopeless or helpless. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You can assess that young man without condemning or forgiving him. "He drinks too much," I said. My statement was not volitional. I just made it without really knowing why. For an instant I even felt that someone standing behind me had voiced the words. I was moved to explain that my statement was another of my speculations. That was not the case, Don Juan said. Your tone of voice had a certainty that you lacked before. You didn't say, maybe he's a drunkard. I felt embarrassed, although I could not exactly determine why. Don Juan laughed. You saw through the man, he said. That was seeing. Seeing is like that. Statements are made with great certainty, and one doesn't know how it happened. You know that young man's tonal was shot, but you don't know how you know it. I had to admit that somehow I'd had that impression. You're right, Don Juan said. It doesn't really matter that he's young. He's as decrepit as the two women. Youth is in no way a barrier against the deterioration of the tonal. You thought that there might be a great many reasons for that man's condition. I find that there is only one. His tonal. It is not that his tonal is weak because he drinks. It is the other way around. He drinks because his tonal is weak. That weakness forces him to be what he is. But the same thing happens to all of us in one form or another. But aren't you also justifying his behaviour by saying that it's his tonal? I'm giving you an explanation that you have never encountered before. It is not a justification or a condemnation, though. That young man's tonal is weak and timid, and yet he's not unique. All of us are more or less in the same boat. At that moment, a very large man passed in front of us, heading towards the church. He was wearing an expensive dark grey business suit and was carrying a briefcase. The collar of his shirt was unbuttoned and his necktie loose. He was sweating profusely. He had a very light complexion which made the perspiration all the more obvious. Watch him, Don Juan ordered me. The man's steps were small but heavy. There was a wobbling quality to his walking. He did not go up to the church. He circumvented it and disappeared behind it. There is no need to treat the body in such an awful manner, Don Juan said, with a note of scorn. But the sad fact is that all of us have learnt to perfection how to make our tonal weak. I have called that indulging. He put his hand on my notebook and did not let me write anymore. His rationale was that as long as I kept on taking notes, I was incapable of concentrating. He suggested I should relax, shut off the internal dialogue, and let go, merging with the person being observed. I asked him to explain what he meant by merging. He said there was no way to explain it, that it was something that the body felt or did when put in observational contact with other bodies. He then clarified the issue by saying that in the past he had called that process seeing, and that it consisted of a lull of true silence within, followed by an outward elongation of something in the self, an elongation that met and merged with the other body, with anything within one's field of awareness. At that point I wanted to get back to my writing pad, but he stopped me and began to single out different people from the crowd that passed by. He pointed out dozens of persons covering a wide range of types among men, women and children of various ages. Don Juan said that he had selected persons whose weak tonal could fit into a categorization scheme, and thus he had acquainted me with a preconceived variety of indulging. I did not remember all the people he had pointed out and discussed. I complained that if I had taken notes I could have at least sketched out the intricacies of his schemata on indulging. As it was, he did not want to repeat it, or perhaps he did not remember it either. He laughed and said that he did not remember it because in the life of a sorcerer it was the Nawa that was accountable for creativity. He looked at the sky and said that it was getting late, and that from that moment on we were going to change direction. Instead of weak tonals, we were going to wait for the appearance of a proper tonal. He added that only a warrior had a proper tonal, and that the average man, at best, could have a right tonal. After a few minutes' wait, he slapped his thigh and chuckled. "Look who's coming now," he said, pointing to the street with a movement of his chin. "It is as if they were made to order." I saw 3 male Indians approaching. They had on some short brown woolen ponchos, white pants that came to their mid-calf, long-sleeved white tops, dirty worn-out sandals, and old straw hats. Each of them carried a bundle tied to his back. Don Juan stood up and went to meet them. He spoke to them. They seemed surprised and surrounded him. They smiled at him. He was apparently telling them something about me. The 3 of them turned around and smiled at me. They were about 10 or 12 feet away. I listened carefully, but I could not hear what they were saying. Don Juan reached in his pocket and handed them some bills. They appeared to be pleased. They moved their feet nervously. I liked them very much. They looked like children. All of them had small white teeth and very pleasing mild features. One, by all appearances the eldest, had whiskers. His eyes were tired but very kind. He took off his hat and came closer to the bench. The others followed him. The 3 of them greeted me in unison. We shook hands. Don Juan told me to give them some money. They thanked me, and after a polite silence they said goodbye. Don Juan sat back down on the bench and we watched them disappear in the crowd. I told Don Juan that for some strange reason I had liked them very much. "It isn't so strange," he said. "You must have felt that their tonal is just right. It is right, but not for our time. You probably felt they were like children. They are, and that is very tough. I understand them better than you, thus I couldn't help but feel a tinge of sadness. Indians are like dogs. They have nothing. But that is the nature of their fortune, and I shouldn't feel sad. My sadness, of course, is my own way of indulging." "Where are they from, Don Juan?" "From the Sierras. They've come here to seek their fortune. They want to become merchants. They're brothers. I told them that I also came from the Sierras, and I'm a merchant myself. I said that you were my partner. The money we gave them was a token. A warrior should give tokens like that all the time. They no doubt need the money, but need should not be an essential consideration for a token. The thing to look for is feeling. I personally was moved by those 3. Indians are the losers of our time. Their downfall began with the Spaniards, and now under the reign of their descendants, the Indians have lost everything. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Indians have lost their tonal." "Is that a metaphor, Don Juan?" "No, it is a fact. The tonal is very vulnerable. It cannot withstand maltreatment. The white man, from the day he set foot on this land, has systematically destroyed not only the Indian tonal of the time, but also the personal tonal of every Indian. One can easily surmise that for the poor average Indian, the reign of the white man has been sheer hell. And yet, the irony is that for another kind of Indian, it has been sheer bliss." "Who are you talking about? What kind of Indian is that?" "The sorcerer. For the sorcerer, the conquest was the challenge of a lifetime. They were the only ones who were not destroyed by it, but adapted to it and used it to their ultimate advantage." "How was that possible, Don Juan? I was under the impression that the Spaniards left no stone unturned." "Let's say that they turned over all the stones that were within the limits of their own tonal. In the Indian life, however, there were things that were incomprehensible to the white man. Those things he did not even notice. Perhaps it was the sheer luck of the sorcerers, or perhaps it was their knowledge that saved them. After the tonal of the time and the personal tonal of every Indian was obliterated, the sorcerers found themselves holding on to the only thing left uncontested, the narwhal. In other words, their tonal took refuge in their narwhal. This couldn't have happened had it not been for the excruciating conditions of a vanquished people. The men of knowledge of today are the product of those conditions and are the ultimate connoisseurs of the narwhal, since they were left there thoroughly alone. There the white man has never ventured. In fact, he doesn't even have the idea it exists. I felt compelled at that point to present an argument. I sincerely contended that in European thought we had accounted for what he called the narwhal. I brought in the concept of the transcendental ego, or the unobserved observer present in all our thoughts, perceptions and feelings. I explained to Don Juan that the individual could perceive or intuit himself, as a self, through the transcendental ego, because this was the only thing capable of judgment, capable of disclosing reality within the realm of its consciousness. Don Juan was unruffled. He laughed. Disclosing reality, he said, mimicking me. That's the tonal. I argued that the tonal may be called the empirical ego, found in one's passing stream of consciousness or experience, while the transcendental ego was found behind that stream. Watching, I suppose, he said mockingly. That's right, watching itself, I said. I hear you talking, he said, but you're saying nothing. The narwhal is not experience or intuition or consciousness. Those terms and everything else you may care to say are only items on the island of the tonal. The narwhal, on the other hand, is only effect. The tonal begins at birth and ends at death, but the narwhal never ends. The narwhal has no limit. I've said that the narwhal is where power hovers. That was only a way of alluding to it. By reasons of its effect, perhaps the narwhal can be best understood in terms of power. For instance, when you felt numb and couldn't talk earlier today, I was actually soothing you. That is, my narwhal was acting upon you. How was that possible, Don Juan? You won't believe this, but no one knows how. All I know is that I wanted your undivided attention, and then my narwhal went to work on you. I know that much because I can witness its effect, but I don't know how it works. He was quiet for a while. I wanted to keep on the same topic. I attempted to ask a question. He silenced. One can say that the narwhal accounts for creativity, he finally said, and looked at me piercing. The narwhal is the only part of us that can create. He remained quiet, looking at me. I felt he was definitely leading me into an area I had wished he would elucidate further. He had said that the tonal did not create anything, but only witnessed and assessed. I asked how he explained the fact that we construct superb structures and machines. That's not creativity, he said. That's only moulding. We can mould anything with our hands, personally or in conjunction with the hands of other tonals. A group of tonals can mould anything, superb structures, as you said. But what's creativity then, Don Juan? He stared at me, squinting his eyes. He chuckled softly, lifted his right hand over his head, and twisted his wrist with a sharp jerk, as if he were turning a doorknob. Creativity is this, he said, and brought his hand with a cupped palm to the level of my eyes. It took me an incredibly long time to focus my eyes on his hand. I felt that a transparent membrane was holding my whole body in a fixed position, and that I had to break it in order to place my sight on his hand. I struggled until beads of perspiration ran into my eyes. Finally I heard or felt a pop, and my eyes and head jerked free. On his right palm there was the most curious rodent I had ever seen. It looked like a bushy-tailed squirrel. The tail, however, was more like a porcupine's. It had stiff quills. "Touch it," Don Juan said softly. I automatically obeyed him and ran my finger on its soft back. Don Juan brought his hand closer to my eyes, and then I noticed something that threw me into nervous spasms. The squirrel had eyeglasses and big teeth. "It looks like a Japanese," I said, and began to laugh hysterically. The rodent then started to grow in Don Juan's palm, and while my eyes were still filled with tears of laughter, the rodent became so enormous that it disappeared. It literally went out of the frame of my vision. It happened so rapidly that I was caught in the middle of a spasm of laughter. When I looked again, or when I wiped my eyes and focused them properly, I was looking at Don Juan. He was sitting on the bench and I was standing in front of him, although I did not remember having stood up. For a moment, my nervousness was uncontainable. Don Juan calmly got up, forced me to sit, propped my chin between the bicep and forearm of his left arm, and hit me on the very top of my head with the knuckles of his right hand. The effect was like the jolt of an electric current. It calmed me down immediately. There were so many things that I wanted to ask, but my words could not wade through all those thoughts. I then became keenly aware that I had lost control over my vocal cords. I did not want to struggle to speak, however, and leaned against the back of the bench. Don Juan said forcefully that I had to pull myself together and stop indulging. I felt a bit dizzy. He imperatively ordered me to write my notes and handed me my pad and pencil, after picking them up from underneath the bench. I made a supreme effort to say something, and again I had the clear sensation that a membrane was enveloping me. I puffed and groaned for a moment while Don Juan laughed, until I heard or felt another pop. I began to write immediately. Don Juan spoke as if he were dictating to me. "One of the acts of a warrior is never to let anything affect him," he said. "Thus, a warrior may be seeing the devil himself, but he won't let anyone know that. The control of a warrior has to be impeccable." He waited until I had finished writing, and then asked me, laughing, "Did you get all that?" I suggested that we should go to a restaurant and have dinner. I was famished. He said that we had to stay until the proper tonal appeared. He added in a serious tone that if the proper tonal did not come that day, we had to remain on the bench until it cared to show up. "What is a proper tonal?" I asked. "A tonal that is just right, balanced and harmonious. You are supposed to find one today, or rather your power is supposed to bring one to us." "But how can I tell it apart from other tonals?" "Never mind that, I will point it out to you." "What is it like, Don Juan?" "Hard to tell, it depends on you. This is a show for you, therefore you will set up those conditions yourself." "How?" "I don't know that. Your power, your nawal, will do that. There are, roughly speaking, two sides to every tonal. One is the outer part, the fringe, the surface of the island. That's the part related to action and acting, the rugged side. The other part is the decision and judgment, the inner tonal, softer, more delicate and more complex. The proper tonal is a tonal where the two levels are in perfect harmony and balance." Don Juan stopped talking. It was fairly dark by then, and I had a hard time taking notes. He told me to stretch and relax. He said that it had been quite an exhausting day, but very prolific, and that he was sure that the proper tonal would show up. Dozens of people went by. We sat in a relaxed silence for 10 or 15 minutes. Then Don Juan stood up abruptly. "By golly, you've done it. Look what's coming there, a girl." He pointed with a nod of his head to a young woman who was crossing the park and was approaching the vicinity of our bench. Don Juan said that the young woman was the proper tonal, that if she would stop to talk to either one of us, it would be an extraordinary omen, and we would have to do whatever she wanted. I could not clearly distinguish the young woman's features, although there was still enough light. She came within a couple of feet, but went by without looking at us. Don Juan ordered me, in a whisper, to get up and go talk to her. I ran after her and asked for directions. I got very close to her. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, of medium height, very attractive and well-groomed. Her eyes were clear and peaceful. She smiled at me as I spoke. There was something winning about her. I liked her as much as I had liked the 3 Indians. I went back to the bench and sat down. "Is she a warrior?" I asked. "Not quite," Don Juan said. "Your power is not that keen yet to bring a warrior, but she is a just right tonal, one that could turn into a proper tonal. Warriors come from that stock." His statements aroused my curiosity. I asked him if women could be warriors. He looked at me, apparently baffled by my question. "Of course they can," he said, "and they are even better equipped for the path of knowledge than men. But the men are a bit more resilient. I would say, however, that all in all, women have a slight advantage." I said that it puzzled me that we had never talked about women in relation to his knowledge. "You're a man," he said, "therefore I use the masculine gender when I talk to you, that's all. The rest is the same." I wanted to question him further, but he made a gesture to close the topic. He looked up. The sky was almost black. The banks of clouds looked extremely dark. There were still, however, some areas where the clouds were slightly orange. "The end of the day is your best time," Don Juan said. "The appearance of that young woman at the very edge of the day is an omen. We were talking about the tonal, therefore it is an omen about your tonal." "What does the omen mean, Don Juan?" "It means that you have very little time left to organize your arrangements. Any arrangements that you might have constructed have to be viable arrangements, because you don't have time to make new ones. Your arrangements must work now, or they are not arrangements at all. I suggest that when you go back home, you check your lines and make sure they are strong. You will need them." "What's going to happen to me, Don Juan?" "Years ago you bid for power. You have followed the hardships of learning faithfully, without fretting or rushing. You're now at the edge of the day. What does that mean?" "For a proper tonal, everything on the island of the tonal is a challenge. Another way of saying it is that for a warrior, everything in this world is a challenge. The greatest challenge of all, of course, is his bid for power. But power comes from the Nawal, and when a warrior finds himself at the edge of the day, it means that the hour of the Nawal is approaching. The warrior's hour of power. I still don't understand the meaning of all this, Don Juan. Does it mean that I'm going to die soon?" "If you're stupid, you will," he retorted cuttingly. "But putting it in milder terms, it means that you're about to shiver in your pants. You bid for power once, and that bidding is irreversible. I won't say that you're about to fulfill your destiny, because there is no destiny. The only thing that one can say then is that you're about to fulfill your power. The omen was clear. That young woman came to you at the edge of the day. You have little time left, and none of it for crap. A fine state. I would say that the best of us always comes out when we are against the wall, when we feel the swords dangling overhead. Personally, I wouldn't have it any other way."
"This is a pile of nonsense," he declared. "None of it will do. The stories are related exclusively to you as a person who thinks, feels, cries, or doesn't feel anything at all. The memorable events of a shaman's album are affairs that will stand the test of time, because they have nothing to do with him. And yet, he is in the thick of them. He'll always be in the thick of them for the duration of his life, and perhaps beyond, but not quite personally. His words left me feeling dejected, totally defeated. I sincerely believed in those days that Don Juan was an intransigent old man who found special delight in making me feel stupid. He reminded me of a master craftsman I had met at a sculptor's foundry where I had worked while going to art school. The master artisan used to criticize and find flaws with everything his advanced apprentices did, and would demand that they correct their work according to his recommendations. His apprentices would turn around and pretend to correct their work. I remembered the glee of the master when he would say, upon being presented with the same work, "Now you have a real thing." "Don't feel bad," Don Juan said, shaking me out of my recollection. "In my time, I was in the same spot. For years, not only did I not know what to choose, I thought I had no experiences to choose from. It seemed that nothing had ever happened to me. Of course, everything had happened to me. But in my effort to defend the idea of myself, I had no time or inclination to notice anything. Can you tell me, Don Juan, specifically what is wrong with my stories? I know that they are nothing, but the rest of my life is just like that." "I will repeat this to you," he said. "The stories of a warrior's album are not personal. Your story of the day you were admitted to school is nothing but your assertion about you as the center of everything. You feel, you don't feel. You realize, you don't realize. Do you see what I mean? All of the story is just you." "But how can it be otherwise, Don Juan?" I asked. "In your other story, you almost touch on what I want, but you turn it again into something extremely personal. I know that you could add more details, but all those details would be an extension of your person and nothing else." "I sincerely cannot see your point, Don Juan," I protested. "Every story seen through the eyes of the witness has to be perforce personal." Yes, of course," he said, smiling, delighted as usual by my confusion. "But then they are not stories for a warrior's album. They are stories for other purposes. The memorable events we are after have the dark touch of the impersonal. That touch permeates them. I don't know how else to explain this." I believed then that I had a moment of inspiration, and that I understood what he meant by the dark touch of the impersonal. I thought that he meant something a bit morbid. Darkness meant that for me, and I related to him a story from my childhood. One of my older cousins, a medical student, took me to see a corpse in the morgue. He told me that I owed it to myself to go and see such a sight because it was very educational. It demonstrated the transitory nature of life. What he didn't tell me was that one of the corpses, which had belonged to a young man who had died of tuberculosis, was going to actually move with a rattle on the marble table where all the corpses were lying, as if it were getting ready to sit up. It made a burping sound that was so awful that it burned through me and will remain in my memory for the rest of my life. My cousin, the doctor, the scientist, explained that it was the corpse of a man who had died of tuberculosis, and that his lungs had been eaten away by bacilli that had left enormous holes filled with air, and that in cases like this, when the air changed temperature, it sometimes forced the body to sit up, or at least convulse. "No, you haven't gotten it yet," Don Juan said, shaking his head. "It is merely a story about your fear. I would have been scared to death myself. However, being scared like that doesn't illuminate anyone's path. But I'm curious to know what happened to you." "I yelled like a banshee," I said. "My cousin called me a coward, a yellow belly, for hiding my face against his chest and for getting sick to my stomach all over him." I had definitely hooked onto a morbid strand in my life. I told him then the story of my best friend, Roy Goldpiss. He actually had a Polish surname, but his friends called him Goldpiss because whatever he touched, he turned to gold. He was a great businessman. His talent for business made him a super ambitious being. He wanted to be the richest man in the world. However, he found the competition was too tough. According to him, doing business alone, he couldn't possibly compete, for instance, with the head of an Islamic sect, who at that time got paid his weight in gold every year. The head of the sect would fatten himself as much as his body allowed him before he was weighed. Then my friend Roy lowered his sights to being the richest man in the United States. The competition in this sector was ferocious. He went down a notch. Perhaps he could be the richest man in California. He was too late for that, too. He gave up hope that with his chains of pizza and ice cream parlors, he could ever rise in the business world to compete with the established families who owned California. He settled for being the richest man in Woodland Hills, the suburb of Los Angeles where he lived. Unfortunately for him, one of his neighbors was Mr. Marsh, who owned factories that produced A1 quality mattresses all over the United States, and he was rich beyond belief. Roy's frustration knew no limits. His drive to accomplish was so intense that it finally impaired his health. One day he died from an aneurysm in his brain. Roy's wife begged me, as his best friend, to make sure that the corpse was properly dressed. I went to the funeral parlor, where I was led by a male secretary to the inner chambers. At the precise moment I arrived, the mortician, working on a high marble-topped table, was forcefully pushing up the corners of the upper lip of the corpse, which had already entered rigor mortis, with the index and little finger of his right hand, while he held his middle fingers against his palm. As a grotesque smile appeared on Roy's dead face, the mortician half turned to me and said in a servile tone, "I hope all this is to your satisfaction, sir." His wife, it'll never be known whether she liked him or not, decided to bury him with all the garishness that, in her opinion, his life deserved. She had bought a most expensive coffin, a custom-made affair that looked like a telephone booth. She had gotten the idea from a movie. Roy was going to be buried sitting, as if he were making a business call on the telephone. I didn't stay for the ceremony. I left in the midst of a most violent reaction, a mixture of impotence and anger, the kind of anger that couldn't be vented on anyone. "You certainly are morbid today," Don Juan commented, laughing, "but in spite of that, or perhaps because of that, you're almost there. You're touching it. The stories that should go in your album of memorable events," he went on, "are those that have the dark touch of the impersonal, because they touch not only you, but every one of us human beings." Don Juan Matus set me to the task of finding the events of my life that bore this universal stamp. Events that have profound personal significance for me, and yet which enter into the realm of the abstract, the active side of infinity. What follows are 4 stories from my album of memorable events, stories gathered over a lifetime on the path of a warrior. First story, A Journey of Power. At the time I met Don Juan, I was a fairly studious anthropology student, and I wanted to begin my career as a professional anthropologist by publishing as much as possible. I was bent on climbing the academic ladder, and in my calculations, I had determined that the first step was to collect data on the uses of medicinal plants by the Indians of the southwestern United States. I first asked a professor of anthropology who had worked in that area for advice about my project. He was a prominent ethnologist who had published extensively in the late 30s and early 40s on the California Indians and the Indians of the Southwest and Sonora, Mexico. He patiently listened to my exposition. My idea was to write a paper, call it Ethnobotanical Data, and publish it in a journal that dealt exclusively with anthropological issues of the southwestern United States. I proposed to collect medicinal plants, take the samples to the botanical garden at UCLA to be properly identified, and then describe why and how the Indians of the Southwest used them. I envisioned collecting thousands of entries. I even envisioned publishing a small encyclopedia on the subject. The professor smiled forgivingly at me. "I don't want to dampen your enthusiasm," he said in a tired voice, "but I can't help commenting negatively on your eagerness. Eagerness is welcome in anthropology, but it must be properly channeled. Don't you think that you should pay more attention to your formal studies?" he continued. "Rather than doing field work, wouldn't it be better for you to study linguistics? We have in the department here one of the most prominent linguists in the world. If I were you, I'd be sitting at his feet, catching any drift emanating from him. We also have a superb authority in comparative religions, and there are exceptionally competent anthropologists who have done work on kinship systems in cultures all over the world, from the point of view of linguistics and from the point of view of cognition. You need a lot of preparation. To think that you could do field work now is a travesty. Plunge into your books, young man. That's my advice." Stubbornly, I took my proposition to another professor, a younger one. He wasn't in any way more helpful. He laughed at me openly. He told me that the paper I wanted to write was a Mickey Mouse paper, and that it wasn't anthropology by any stretch of the imagination. Anthropologists nowadays, he said professorially, are concerned with issues that have relevance. Medical and pharmaceutical sciences have done endless research on every possible medicinal plant in the world. There's no longer any bone to chew in there. Your kind of data collecting belongs to the turn of the 19th century. Now it's nearly 200 years later. There is such a thing as progress, you know? Anthropology is the only discipline in existence, he continued, which can clearly substantiate the concept of progress and perfectibility. Thank God that there's still a ray of hope in the midst of the cynicism of our times. Only anthropologists can prove to mankind, beyond the shadow of a doubt, the progress of human knowledge. That's anthropology for you, not some puny fieldwork, which is not fieldwork at all, but mere masturbation. It was a blow on the head to me. As a last resort, I went to Arizona to talk to anthropologists who were actually doing fieldwork there. By then, I was ready to give up on the whole idea. I understood what the two professors were trying to tell me. I couldn't have agreed with them more. My attempts at doing fieldwork were definitely simple-minded. Yet I wanted to get my feet wet in the field. I didn't want to do only library research. In Arizona, I met with an extremely seasoned anthropologist who had written a great deal about the Yaqui Indians of Arizona, as well as those of Sonora, Mexico. He was extremely kind. He didn't run me down, nor did he give me any advice. He only commented that the Indian societies of the Southwest were extremely isolationist, and that they distrusted or even despised foreigners, especially those of Hispanic origin. A younger colleague of his, however, was more outspoken. He said that I was better off reading herbalists' books. He was an authority in the field, and his opinion was that anything to be known about medicinal plants from the Southwest had already been classified and talked about in various publications. He went as far as to say that the sources of any Indian curer of the day were precisely those publications, rather than any traditional knowledge. He finished me off with the assertion that if there still were any traditional curing practices, the Indians would not divulge them to a stranger. Do something worthwhile, he advised me. Look into urban anthropology. There's a lot of money for studies on alcoholism among Indians in the big city, for example. Now that's something that any anthropologist can do easily. Go and get drunk with local Indians in a bar. Then arrange whatever you find out about them in terms of statistics. Turn everything into numbers. Urban anthropology is a real field. There was nothing else for me to do except to take the advice of those experienced social scientists. I decided to fly back to Los Angeles. But another anthropologist friend of mine let me know then that he was going to drive throughout Arizona and New Mexico, visiting all the places where he had done work in the past, renewing in this fashion his relationships with the people who had been his anthropological informants. You're welcome to come with me, he said. I'm not going to do any work. I'm just going to visit with them, have a few drinks with them, bullshit with them. I bought gifts for them, blankets, booze, jackets, ammunition for .22 caliber rifles. My car is loaded with goodies. I usually drive alone whenever I go to see them, but by myself I always run the risk of falling asleep. You could keep me company, keep me from dozing off, or drive a little bit if I'm too drunk. I felt so despondent that I turned him down. I'm very sorry, Bill, I said, the trip won't do for me. I see no point in pursuing this idea of field work any longer. Don't give up without a fight, Bill said in a tone of paternal concern. Give all you have to the fight, and if it licks you, then it's okay to give up. But not before. Come with me and see how you like the Southwest. He put his arm around my shoulders. I couldn't help noticing how immensely heavy his arm was. He was tall and husky, but in recent years his body had acquired a strange rigidity. He had lost his boyish quality. His round face was no longer filled, youthful, the way it had been. Now it was a worried face. I believed that he worried because he was losing his hair, but at times it seemed to me that it was something more than that. And it wasn't that he'd gained weight. His body was heavy in ways that were impossible to explain. I noticed it in the way that he walked, then got up and sat down. Bill seemed to me to be fighting gravity with every fiber of his being, in everything he did. Disregarding my feelings of defeat, I started on a journey with him. We visited every place in Arizona and New Mexico where there were Indians. One of the end results of this trip was that I found out that my anthropologist friend had two definite facets to his person. He explained to me that his opinions as a professional anthropologist were very measured and congruous with the anthropological thought of the day, but that as a private person, his anthropological fieldwork had given him a wealth of experiences that he never talked about. These experiences were not congruous with the anthropological thought of the day because they were events that were impossible to catalog. During the course of our trip, he would invariably have some drinks with his ex-informants and feel very relaxed afterward. I would take the wheel then and drive as he sat in the passenger seat taking sips from his bottle of 30-year-old Ballantines. It was then that Bill would talk about his uncatalogued experiences. "I've never believed in ghosts," he said abruptly one day. "I never went for apparitions and floating essences, voices in the dark, you know. I had a very pragmatic, serious upbringing. Science had always been my compass. But then, working in the field, all kinds of weird crap began to filter through to me. For instance, I went with some Indians one night on a vision quest. They were going to actually initiate me by some painful business of piercing the muscles of my chest. They were preparing a sweat lodge in the woods. I had resigned myself to withstand the pain. I took a couple of drinks to give me strength, and then the man who was going to intercede for me with the people who actually performed the ceremony yelled in horror and pointed at a dark, shadowy figure walking towards us. When the shadowy figure came closer to me, Bill went on, I noticed that what I had in front of me was an old Indian, dressed in the weirdest getup you could imagine. He had the paraphernalia of shamans. The man I was with that night fainted shamelessly at the sight of the old man. The old man came to me and pointed a finger at my chest. His finger was just skin and bone. He babbled incomprehensible things to me. By then, the rest of the people had seen the old man and started to rush silently towards me. The old man turned to look at them, and every one of them froze. He harangued them for a moment. His voice was something unforgettable. It was as if he were talking from a tube, or as if he had something attached to his mouth that carried the words out of him. I swear to you that I saw the man talking inside his body, and his mouth broadcasting the words as a mechanical apparatus. After haranguing the men, the old man continued walking, past me, past them, and disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Bill said that the plan to have an initiation ceremony went to pot. It was never performed, and the men, including the shamans in charge, were shaking in their boots. He stated that they were so frightened that they disbanded and left. People who had been friends for years, he went on, never spoke to each other again. They claimed that what they had seen was the apparition of an incredibly old shaman, and that it would bring bad luck to talk about it among themselves. In fact, they said that the mere act of setting eyes on one another would bring them bad luck. Most of them moved away from the area. Why did they feel that talking to each other or seeing each other would bring them bad luck, I asked him. Those are their beliefs, he replied. A vision of that nature means to them that the apparition spoke to each of them individually. To have a vision of that nature is, for them, the luck of a lifetime. And what was the individual thing that the vision told each of them, I asked. Beats me, he replied. They never explained anything to me. Every time I asked them, they entered into a profound state of numbness. They hadn't seen anything. They hadn't heard anything. Years after the event, the man who had fainted next to me swore to me that he had just faked the faint because he was so frightened that he didn't want to face the old man, and that what he had to say was understood by everybody at a level other than language comprehension. Bill said that in his case, what the apparition voiced to him, he understood as having to do with his health and his expectations in life. What do you mean by that? I asked him. Things are not that good for me, he confessed. My body doesn't feel well. But do you know what is really the matter with you? I asked. Oh yes, he said nonchalantly. Doctors have told me. But I'm not going to worry about it or even think about it. Bill's revelations left me feeling thoroughly uneasy. This was a facet of his person that I didn't know. I'd always thought that he was a tough old cookie. I could never conceive of him as vulnerable. I didn't like our exchange. It was, however, too late for me to retreat. Our trip continued. On another occasion, he confided that the shamans of the Southwest were capable of transforming themselves into different entities, and that the categorization schemes of bear shaman or mountain lion shaman, etc., should not be taken as euphemisms or metaphors because they were not. Would you believe it, he said in a tone of great admiration, that there are some shamans who actually become bears, or mountain lions, or eagles? I'm not exaggerating, nor am I fabricating anything when I say that once I witnessed the transformation of a shaman who called himself Riverman, or River Shaman, or proceeding from river, returning to river. I was out in the mountains of New Mexico with this shaman. I was driving for him. He trusted me, and he was going in search of his origin, or so he said. We were walking along a river when he suddenly got very excited. He told me to move away from the shore to some high rocks and hide there, put a blanket over my head and shoulders, and peek through it so I would not miss what he was about to do. What was he going to do? I asked him, incapable of containing myself. I didn't know, he said. Your guess would have been as good as mine. I had no way of conceiving what he was going to do. He just walked into the water, fully dressed. When the water reached him at mid-calf, because it was a wide but shallow river, the shaman simply vanished, disappeared. Prior to entering the water, he had whispered in my ear that I should go downstream and wait for him. He told me the exact spot where to wait. I, of course, didn't believe a word of what he was saying, so at first I couldn't remember where he had said I had to wait for him. But then I found the spot, and I saw the shaman coming out of the water. It sounds stupid to say coming out of the water. I saw the shaman turning into water, and then being remade out of the water. Can you believe that? I had no comments on his stories. It was impossible for me to believe him, but I could not disbelieve him either. He was a very serious man. The only possible explanation that I could think of was that as we continued our trip, he drank more and more every day. He had in the trunk of the car a box of 24 bottles of scotch for only himself. He actually drank like a fish. I've always been partial to the esoteric mutations of shamans, he said to me another day. It's not that I can explain the mutations, or even believe that they take place, but as an intellectual exercise, I am very interested in considering that mutations into snakes and mountain lions are not as difficult as what the water shaman did. It is at moments like this when I engage my intellect in such a fashion that I cease to be an anthropologist, and I begin to react, following a gut feeling. My gut feeling is that those shamans certainly do something that can't be measured scientifically or even talked about intelligently. For instance, there are cloud shamans who turn into clouds, into mist. I've never seen this happen, but I knew a cloud shaman. I never saw him disappearing or turning into mist in front of my eyes as I saw that other shaman turning into water right in front of me. But I chased that cloud shaman once and he simply vanished in an area where there was no place for him to hide. Although I didn't see him turning into a cloud, he disappeared. I couldn't explain where he went. There were no rocks or vegetation around the place where he ended up. I was there half a minute after he was, but the shaman was gone. I chased that man all over the place for information, Bill went on. He wouldn't give me the time of day. He was very friendly to me, but that was all. Bill told me endless other stories about strife and political factions among Indians in different Indian reservations, or stories about personal vendettas, animosities, friendships, etc., which did not interest me in the least. On the other hand, his stories about shamans' mutations and apparitions had caused a true emotional upheaval in me. I was at once fascinated and appalled by them. However, when I tried to think why I was fascinated or appalled, I couldn't tell. All I could have said was that his stories about shamans hit me at an unknown, visceral level.